The most unsettling thing about the Flannan Isles disappearance is not simply that 3 men vanished from Eilean Mor. It is that the official trail they left behind is almost painfully ordinary. No radio call carried their voices to shore. No eyewitness saw a rescue fail. No bodies came back from the sea. There was only a light that should have been burning, a relief vessel delayed by weather, a few working notes, missing outdoor clothing, and damage at a landing place where the Atlantic had reached with terrible force. A lighthouse exists to turn danger into warning. It takes a reef, a headland, a hidden coast, and gives it a signal that can be read in darkness. But in December 1900, on the western edge of Scotland, the warning reversed direction. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse, built to speak outward to ships, became itself the message. Something was wrong, not because anyone cried out, but because the beam was gone. The first clear fracture in the record came from the sea. Around midnight on 15 December 1900, a passing steamer reported that the Flannan Light was not operating. National Records of Scotland identifies the vessel as SS Archtor under Captain Holman. The report was simple, almost administrative. A light expected to be visible was dark. Yet for a lighthouse station, that was not a small irregularity. It was the one failure that could be seen from outside. On duty at the station were Principal Keeper James Ducat, Assistant Lightkeeper Thomas Marshall, and Occasional Keeper Donald MacArthur. Their work was built around repetition and precision. Lamps had to be maintained. Machinery had to be kept in order. Observations had to be recorded. The light was not decoration, not symbol, not a comfort for distant watchers. It was a working instrument in a maritime safety system. If it failed, the failure mattered beyond the island. And still, when that failure was first noticed, there was no direct voice from Eilean Mor to explain it. There was no radio communication between Flannan and Lewis at the time of the disappearance. That absence is central to the entire case. It means the lighthouse could not send a distress message in the modern sense. The keepers could not call the shore station at Briskleet. They could not speak across the water to the Isle of Lewis and report illness, damage, or accident. The station was connected to the mainland system by schedules, sightlines, relief vessels, and later telegrams, but not by a living wire of speech. Because of that limitation, a watch had been placed on shore. Roderick Mackenzie, a gamekeeper on Lewis, was appointed to observe the Flannan Light from Gallen Head and report failures by telegram. It was an arrangement that tells us something important about the period. Safety did not depend only on the men inside the tower. It also depended on someone far away being able to see the signal, recognize its absence, and send word through the proper channels. But sightlines are not certainty. Weather, darkness, distance, and sea conditions all stood between Lewis and Eilean Mor. The lighthouse was part of a chain, and every link was exposed. A lamp could fail. A report could be delayed. A vessel could be held back. A watcher could look toward an island hidden by the weather and see nothing useful at all. That is why the report from SS Archtor matters. It is not a dramatic distress call. It is not a final confession. It does not tell us what happened inside the lighthouse, or on the steps, or at the landing. It does something colder. It marks a point in time when the station's public duty had stopped. Around midnight on 15 December, the light that should have been burning was out. From that point, the case becomes a record of silence. Silence in this story does not mean nothing was happening. It means that whatever happened on Eilean Mor was not being transmitted. If the men were alive at that moment, they had no radio link by which to explain the darkness. If they were already gone, no one on shore could know by asking. The island could not answer. The system had to wait for a vessel to reach it. That vessel was the lighthouse tender Hesperus. It did not arrive at Eilean Mor until 26 December 1900, 11 days after the light had been seen out. Bad weather delayed the relief. Those 11 days are part of the mystery, not because they invite invention, but because they deny recovery. A scene that might have been read more clearly on the first day was instead exposed to Atlantic weather for nearly 2 weeks. The difference between an immediate inspection and an 11-day delay is the difference between evidence and aftermath. This opening chapter has to begin there, with the contradiction and the gap, because much of what has surrounded the Flannan Isles disappearance since then has grown from the emptiness between those dates. Legends have entered the story. Poems and retellings have supplied images that feel unforgettable. But an archive report has to move more carefully. It has to begin with the traces that can be named. The trace is the missing light. The trace is the steamer, SS Archtor, and the report that the beam was not showing around midnight on 15 December. The trace is the communication system that could not carry a keeper's voice from Flannan to Lewis. The trace is the delayed arrival of Hesperus on 26 December. Later traces would be found inside and outside the station, lamps trimmed and ready, lens and machinery cleaned, a kitchen tidied, outdoor clothing missing for 2 men, log entries ending before the final Slate readings, and storm damage at the West Landing. But those belong to later parts of the record. At the beginning, the evidence is simpler and more severe. A lighthouse had gone dark, and the men responsible for it could not be reached. The power of the Flannan case lies in how little it gives us at first. There is no confirmed last spoken message. No surviving note explains a decision. No body fixes the place of death. Even the official conclusion, formed after inspection, remained cautious. The men were later recorded as probably drowned. That word, probably, is important. It is not the language of legend. It is the language of a state record facing an absence. The title of this episode speaks of a last message beneath the stairs, but the archive asks us to widen what we mean by message. A message does not always arrive as words. In this case, the first message may have been the failure of the light itself. Later, the ordered interior of the lighthouse would say one thing, and the damaged West Landing another. The slate of readings would show routine continuing up to the edge of interruption. The missing oilskins would suggest movement into weather. Iron railings, twisted and displaced, would speak in the language of force. But on the night the outside world first noticed anything wrong, none of that had yet been seen. There was only the absence of a signal from a tower built to signal. That absence traveled outward before any person could travel inward. A ship noticed it. A report entered the official trail. The shore system waited on weather and relief. The men on Eilean Mor, if they were still there, remained beyond speech. If they were not, the lighthouse was already no longer a workplace, but a sealed question standing above the Atlantic. To understand why a darkened beam could carry so much weight, we have to understand where that beam was meant to shine from. Eilean Mor was not an ordinary coastal station with a road behind it and a village within reach. It was the largest island of the Flannan group, west of Lewis, part of a place also known as the Seven Hunters. Its lighthouse stood on the island's highest point, above landings, stairs, weather, and older traces of human presence. Before the report, before the delay, before Hesperus came in sight, there was the island itself, remote, named, watched from a distance, and already difficult to reach. The island named at the end of the first chapter was not just a dot on a chart. It was the ground beneath every later report, every delay, every uncertainty. Eilean Mor gave the mystery its shape before any man disappeared, because the station stood in a place where distance was not an abstraction. Distance decided who could see the light, who could reach the keepers, and how long silence could last. The Flannan Isles lie in the outer Hebrides, west of the Isle of Lewis. National Records of Scotland gives the position of the lighthouse as 21 miles west of Lewis. In Northern Lighthouse Board historical accounts, the observer's line from Gallon Head is described in relation to a light 18 miles northwest. These figures do not need to be forced into contradiction. They tell us the same essential thing from different working viewpoints. The Flannan Light was not part of a village coast. It stood beyond ordinary daily access, out in the Atlantic weather, visible when conditions allowed and unreachable when sea and wind closed the route. The island group is also known as the Seven Hunters. That older name carries atmosphere, but in an archive report, it is important to keep atmosphere in its proper place. The name helps us hear how the islands were recognized and remembered. It does not solve the disappearance. It does not explain the absence of the keepers. It only tells us that long before the lighthouse became the center of a modern maritime mystery, this small western group already had a place in the language and memory of the region. Eilean Mor is the largest island in that group. The name itself means the Big Island, and in the Flannan group, that mattered practically. It was the island selected for the lighthouse, the place with enough ground for the tower, the keepers' buildings, the landings, the stairs, and the working routes that connected the sea to the light. The lighthouse was not placed at random. It stands on the highest point of Eilean Mor, turning the island's own height into part of the warning system. A light raised above the Atlantic could travel farther across the sea, could mark danger and position, and could be watched from Lewis when the air was clear enough. That highest point is more than a scenic fact. It explains the vertical character of the station. The men who served there did not simply step from a pier into a doorway. The shore, the landings, the paths, the stairs, and the tower all belong to one continuous problem: how to bring people, oil, stores, equipment, and messages between a vessel and a light set high above exposed rock. The lighthouse was built to be seen from far away, but that same height made it part of a difficult island machine. Every relief, every inspection near the shore, every movement between the sea and the tower took place inside that geography. Historic Environment Scotland records the lighthouse complex on Eilean Mor as a Category B designated building. That listing belongs to the later language of preservation, but it fixes the site as a real built place, not a stage set for legend. The tower is described as a 23-meter whitewashed rubble tower with a single-story keeper's house clasping its base. The present Northern Lighthouse Board details give the light's elevation as 101 meters, with a range of 20 nautical miles. These measurements help restore scale. The beam that failed in December 1900 came from a structure high above sea level on a small island that itself stood beyond easy human reach. From the outside, the White Tower would have been the most deliberate thing on Eilean Mor, engineered, maintained, and visible by design. But it was not the first human mark on the island. The place also contains older recorded traces, including St. Flannan's Chapel. The Flannan Isles are named after St. Flann, and the chapel site on Eilean Mor is recorded as St. Flannan's Chapel, an early medieval corbelled oratory type. Its internal measurements are given as roughly 5 feet by 7 3/4 feet, with thick walls. That detail is small, almost severe. It gives us no dramatic answer, and we should not ask it to. The chapel is part of the island's recorded place history. It tells us that Eilean Mor had religious associations and human use before the lighthouse builders arrived. It helps explain why the island felt to later writers and visitors like more than a bare rock. But it is not evidence in the disappearance of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. It cannot tell us where they went. It cannot speak for the weather. It cannot replace the log, the slate, the damage reports, or the civil death records. That separation matters because the Flannan Isles story has often been pulled toward folklore. The names, the chapel, the isolation, and the vanished men all invite a kind of darkness that can be satisfying in a poem or retelling. But the archive asks for a narrower discipline. It allows the island to be old without making age into proof. It allows the chapel to deepen the setting without turning it into a cause. In this report, place history provides context. It does not become an explanation. Still, context is not decorative. The older name, the chapel, and the island's position all help us understand why the disappearance settled so firmly into public imagination. A lighthouse on a populated headland might fail and quickly become a matter of repair. A keeper might be absent and a neighbor might notice. But Eilean Mor was separated from the normal checks of community. Its watchers were across water. Its landing places were exposed. Its highest point made the light visible, while its remoteness made the men themselves inaccessible. Even the phrase Outer Hebrides carries practical consequences here. These were not sheltered inland waters. The station belonged to Scotland's west coast maritime world, where weather could interrupt plans and where an island could be seen, known, and yet not reached. The Isle of Lewis was the nearest substantial shore connection, but Lewis did not make Eilean Mor safe in the ordinary sense. It offered a line of sight, an anchorage system, and a base for shore arrangements. It did not offer a road, a harbor beside the tower, or immediate rescue. The geography also explains why later official attention focused so strongly on routes within the island. The disappearance was not investigated only as something that happened in a room or at the lantern. The landings mattered. The stairs mattered. The paths from the tower to the shore mattered. When the light was found deserted, the question became not simply why the men had left the building, but where the island itself might have drawn them. On Eilean Mor, work did not end at the lantern glass. The sea-facing edges of the station were part of the job. That is why the map cannot be skipped. Before we can read the later evidence of trimmed lamps, missing outdoor clothing, or damage near the west landing, we have to picture a lighthouse whose operation depended on a difficult connection between height and shore. The tower stood where it could do its duty best, high, exposed, and visible. The men lived and worked at that height during their turn of service. But supplies, reliefs, inspections, and emergencies all pulled attention downward, toward landing places where the Atlantic had the last word. Eilean Mor, then, was both a platform and a trap of circumstance. It held the light high enough to warn ships over distance. It held the keepers far enough from Lewis that failure could only be reported indirectly. It carried older names and a chapel site that made the island feel inhabited by memory, while the working lighthouse belonged to a much newer system of state-backed maritime safety. Those two histories occupied the same rock, but they should not be confused. The chapel tells us the island was known before the light. The lighthouse tells us why the island became essential to shipping. The disappearance belongs to the fragile overlap between that engineered purpose and the exposed place chosen to serve it. By the time the commissioners of Northern Lighthouses and the Northern Lighthouse Board history enter the record, Eilean Mor is no longer just the largest of the 7 hunters. It becomes a construction problem, a logistics problem, and eventually a communication problem. A light had to be sanctioned, designed, built, supplied, staffed, and relieved on an island west of Lewis. The geography made the station necessary. The same geography made it hard. And once the Board of Trade sanction was granted in 1896, that difficulty had to be turned into stone, iron, stairs, landings, and routine. Once the Board of Trade sanction was granted in 1896, Eilean Mor stopped being only a remote island with an old name and an exposed summit. It became a place to be altered. The difficulty that had existed naturally in the Flannan Isles now had to be answered by engineering: a tower, a house, landings, stairs, stores, and a shore connection far away on Lewis. The Northern Lighthouse Board history gives the formal outline. Sanction for the Flannan Isles Lighthouse was received from the Board of Trade in 1896. The work was completed in 1899, and the light began service that same year. The engineer was David Allen Stevenson, a name belonging to the wider Stevenson Lighthouse engineering family, whose work shaped so much of Scotland's coastal safety system. The builder was George Lawson of Rutherglen. Those names matter because they pulled the story away from myth and back into administration. Before the disappearance became a mystery, the lighthouse was a public work. It was approved, costed, designed, contracted, built, inspected, and brought into service. It belonged to the world of maritime safety, where risk was not imagined. It was measured in bearings, visibility, sea approaches, and the ability of men to keep a light burning in weather that might prevent anyone else from reaching them. The station on Eilean Mor was not simply a tower placed on rock. The Northern Lighthouse Board history records the lighthouse buildings, landing places, and stairs as part of the work, with a cost of £6,914. That figure is useful because it shows the station as a system. The tower was the visible purpose, but the tower could not function by itself. Men had to get ashore. Stores had to be landed. Relief crews had to climb from the sea to the station. Equipment had to be moved from exposed landing places to higher ground. Every part of that movement had to be planned before the first routine watch could begin. Historic Environment Scotland describes the lighthouse itself as a 23-meter whitewashed rubble tower with a single-story keeper's house clasping its base. That description has an almost practical intimacy to it. The keeper's house was not separate in the way a cottage might stand beside a road. It was fixed around the tower, attached to the work of the light. The men who served there lived within the machinery of warning. Their domestic space and their duty space were not truly apart. Inside, Historic Environment Scotland records a serpentine cast iron staircase with a timber handrail. It is a small architectural detail, but in a story built from absence, it becomes important. Later, when the station was found deserted, searchers would move through an interior that had been built for repeated, practical motion, up to the light, down to the living quarters, through the familiar passages of a working station. The cast iron stair was not dramatic in itself. It was part of ordinary maintenance. It was the route between shelter and duty. Above, the tower carried the apparatus of the light, cast iron decking, a lantern with diagonal astragals, a domed cap, and a weather vane. Such details are not decoration in the archive sense. They mark the station as an engineered object, made to survive weather and to project a signal outward across the sea. The lighthouse stood on the highest point of Eilean Mor because height increased its usefulness. The same height also deepened its isolation. To reach that signal from a boat below required landings, stairs, and effort. The safety of ships depended on a light raised above the island. The safety of the keepers depended on the vulnerable route between sea level and that height. The landing places were therefore not secondary features. They were part of the life of the station. A lighthouse on an uninhabited island could not be supplied by intention alone. It required points where boats could come in when conditions allowed, and it required built ways upward from those points. The records preserve the fact of those landing places and stairs, and later reports would focus on one of them with particular force, the West Landing. But at the construction stage, the broader meaning is clear. The station was designed around the knowledge that approach would be difficult and weather would decide what could be done. There is another part of the system that was not on Eilean Mor at all. The lightkeepers' family dwellings were built at the Breescleet Shore Station on the Isle of Lewis, near Loch Rogue, at a cost of £3,526. This detail changes the emotional geography of the lighthouse. The keepers' families were not housed on the island. They were ashore on Lewis while the men rotated through duty at Flannan. The lighthouse was a workplace separated from family life by sea, distance, weather, and schedule. Breescleet was not only a domestic arrangement. It was part of the relief structure. Loch Rogue provided anchorage and shelter for the lighthouse tender when reliefs could not be carried out. That sentence contains the shape of the risk. Relief was expected, planned, and necessary, but it was never guaranteed on the day intended. A tender could be near and still unable to land men or remove them. A storm could turn routine into waiting. In this design, separation was not an accident. It was built into the rhythm of service. The shore station at Breescleet connected the human side of the work to the logistical side. Families, relief keepers, stores, and vessels all belonged to the wider pattern that allowed the light on Eilean Mor to operate. The island station was remote, but it was not independent. It depended on a chain: shore station, tender, anchorage, landing, stairs, keeper's house, tower, lantern. If any part of that chain was broken by weather, the men on Eilean Mor remained where they were, and everyone ashore had to wait for conditions to change. This is why the construction history matters to the disappearance. The lighthouse was made for isolation, but not in a romantic sense. It was made to function despite isolation. The commissioners and engineers accepted that the island lay beyond the ordinary reach of roads, neighbors, and immediate help. They answered with stone, iron, planned landings, and shore-based logistics. But no amount of construction could remove the sea from the arrangement. The sea remained the first barrier and the final authority. The station's later history confirms its significance beyond the event of 1900. Historic Environment Scotland now lists the lighthouse complex as a Category B designated building. The Northern Lighthouse Board records that the station remained manned until 28 September 1971, when it was demanned and became a major automatic light. Its present light characteristic is 2 white flashes every 30 seconds, with an elevation given by the Northern Lighthouse Board as 101 meters and a range of 20 nautical miles. These later facts show that the site continued to serve the same essential purpose long after the men of 1900 were gone. The method changed. The need remained. But in the period we are following, the light was still human work. It depended on keepers to trim lamps, clean machinery, maintain order, watch the weather, and respond to damage. It depended on men moving through that whitewashed tower and down those stairs, men who knew the landing places not as features on a plan, but as part of their daily risk. By 1899, when the Flannan Isles Lighthouse entered service, the island had been transformed into a working station. Yet the transformation did not make Eilean Mor ordinary. It made the isolation operational. The tower rose from the highest point. The landings waited below. The stairs joined sea to light, and Breescleet on Lewis held the families and the relief system at a distance. Into that system came the keepers whose names would later be written into the record of disappearance: James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. Before their absence became the mystery, their presence was part of the design. The lighthouse had been built to separate men from the shore for a purpose. Now it required men trained enough, trusted enough, and accustomed enough to keep that purpose alive. The station on Eilean Mor had been built as a system of stone, iron, light, and routine. But a lighthouse could not keep itself. Its purpose depended on men who understood not only the lamp and the lens, but the discipline of being separated from the shore, watched from a distance, and relieved only when the sea allowed it. By December 1900, the names attached to that duty were James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. They enter the record not as figures from a ghost story, but through service, appointment, and later civil registration. That distinction matters. The Flannan Isles disappearance has often been retold through atmosphere first: the lonely tower, the silent rooms, the sea below the cliffs. But the official trail begins more plainly. It begins with the working identities of 3 lighthouse men who had been placed within a structure run by the commissioners of northern lighthouses. The principal keeper was James Ducat. According to the service record details preserved for the Northern Lighthouse Commissioners, Ducat had entered service on the 21st of November, 1878. He had been born on the 11th of August, 1856. By the time the Flannan disappearance entered the official record, he was not a new hand at lightkeeping. His service had begun more than 2 decades before the events on Eilean Mor. That length of service is one of the quiet facts that pushes the story away from easy sensationalism. Ducat was not an untested man suddenly placed on a remote rock. He belonged to the professional world that had grown around the Scottish lighthouse system: scheduled watches, maintenance, reports, reliefs, and the repeated burden of keeping a light reliable in places where weather and distance could interrupt almost everything else. As principal keeper, Ducat's role was not merely to be present. The title itself implies responsibility within the station. The lighthouse was a working establishment, and the principal keeper stood at the head of the men on duty. The archive notes do not need to supply private scenes or imagined conversations for that responsibility to be understood. In a place like Flannan, order was not decorative. It was the mechanism by which the light remained dependable. There were lamps to be kept ready. There was machinery to be cleaned. There were readings to be taken. There were records to be maintained. There was the constant relationship between the tower above and the landings below, between the safety of the lightroom and the hazards of the rock. The principal keeper's authority belonged to that chain of routine. The second man was Thomas Marshall, assistant lightkeeper. Marshall had entered service with the Northern Lighthouse Commissioners on the 27th of April, 1896. The records also connect him with earlier work as a seaman and as an occasional keeper at Ailsa Craig. Those details place him in the maritime and lighthouse world before Flannan. They show a man whose working life, as far as the surviving record tells us, had already been shaped by the sea and by lightkeeping duty. Ailsa Craig is not the Flannan Isles, and the records do not invite us to turn one posting into a rehearsal for another. But the detail is still important. Marshall was not only named after the event, he had a traceable path into the service. He had experience connected with seafaring, and he had already been linked with lighthouse work before his appointment in the Northern Lighthouse system. At Flannan, as assistant lightkeeper, Marshall was part of the operational body of the station. The assistant's place was below that of the principal keeper, but not marginal. A lighthouse station depended on shared labor. The light did not burn because one man occupied a title. It burned because the men on the roster maintained the apparatus, kept the routines, and responded to the physical conditions around the station. In the later official investigation, the distinction between men and roles would become significant. When the station was found deserted, the condition of the interior, the missing outdoor clothing, and the known habits of the keepers would all be weighed carefully. But before any of that evidence was inspected, Marshall's name already belonged to the roster of service. He was one of the men whose absence would have to be explained not as an isolated personal event, but as the failure of an entire station to answer. The third man was Donald MacArthur. His position at Flannan in December 1900 was different from Ducat's and Marshall's. He was serving as occasional keeper while William Ross, another assistant keeper, was off sick. The wording is plain: but it carries a great deal of meaning. MacArthur was there because the lighthouse system had to continue even when illness disrupted the regular arrangement. A man could be off sick, the light could not be. The presence of an occasional keeper reminds us that the station was part of a larger administrative and logistical network. There were named keepers, relief arrangements, and substitutions. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse did not exist as a romantic outpost outside bureaucracy. It was deeply bureaucratic. Its survival depended on paperwork, appointments, service records, tenders, shore stations, telegrams, and men placed where the system needed them. MacArthur's name is sometimes overshadowed in retellings because the available service details are fewer than those for Ducat and Marshall. But in the actual event, his role was equal in consequence. He was one of the 3 men on the island. He was one of the 3 who disappeared. And he was one of the 3 later recorded in the Carloway death register, with cause of death noted as probably drowning. That phrase, probably drowning, belongs later in the record, after the silence, after the search, after official conclusions were formed. But it is worth holding in mind even here, because it shows the careful limit of what the state could say. The men were not simply folded into legend. Their deaths were recorded, yet the bodies were not found, and the exact sequence was not recovered. The public story would expand into speculation. The official language remained cautious. The same caution applies to Ducat and Marshall. The register entries for them include a note that they disappeared on or about the 15th of December, 1900. That date would become central because the light was reported not operating around midnight on the 15th. But the wording on or about is itself a small archival warning. It tells us that the system could establish a window, not a witnessed moment. It could identify the missing men, their roles, and the later condition of the station. It could not produce the final minute. That is why this chapter must stay close to the service records. The temptation is to turn the 3 men into characters in a sealed room drama, to imagine the mood inside the tower, to invent words spoken at a table, or to assign motives to movements no one saw. But the reliable record gives us something quieter and, in some ways, more unsettling. It gives us trained lighthouse men, known to the service, performing duty at a station built for isolation. It gives us a principal keeper with long experience, an assistant with maritime and light-keeping background, and an occasional keeper filling a necessary post because another man was ill. Nothing in those facts suggests carelessness. Nothing in those facts explains the disappearance by itself. Instead, they define the scale of the problem. If 3 men attached to the lighthouse service could vanish together from a station found later in working order, then the explanation had to account not only for absence, but for the interruption of discipline. A lighthouse keeper's work was meant to leave traces. Not emotional traces, but operational ones. Logs, readings, trimmed lamps, cleaned machinery, ordered rooms, routines that could be checked by the next relief. The men on duty were not expected to communicate their inner lives to history. They were expected to keep the light. At Flannan, that expectation became part of the mystery. The men were present in the system until the system no longer received proof of them. Ducat's long service, Marshall's recorded experience, and MacArthur's temporary duty all converge on the same fact. This was not a casual occupation of an island. It was an official watch. And an official watch requires more than the men at the lamp. It requires a way for the shore to know whether the light is burning. That was the weakness built into the arrangement at Flannan. The men could tend the apparatus, keep the station, and follow the routine, but they could not send a direct wireless message from Eilean Mor to Lewis. There was no radio link. If something happened, the first sign might not come from the keepers at all. It might come from someone far away, looking across the sea for a beam that should have been there. That weakness was not a small technical footnote. It was part of the operating reality of Eilean Mor. The keepers could maintain the lamp, trim it, clean the lens and machinery, record the weather, and hold the station through the long hours of duty. But if the island itself needed help, it had no direct voice. There was no radio communication between Flannan and Lewis at the time of the disappearance. That single fact changes the shape of the whole case. Modern listeners are used to distress as a message sent outward, a call, a signal, a report from the place where the danger is happening. At Flannan in December 1900, the system worked the other way. The island did not speak. It was watched. The safety chain depended on someone else seeing whether the light was there. Because there was no radio link, Roderick Mackenzie, a gamekeeper on Lewis, was appointed as an observer. His task was to watch the Flannan Light from Gallen Head and report failures by telegram. In the official arrangement, he formed one of the human links between the isolated tower on Eilean Mor and the administrative world beyond it. The keepers were on the island. The shore station was at Breescleet, near Loch Roeg. The commissioners of northern lighthouses held the system within their wider structure. But between the rock and the office, between the lamp and the written report, there was a line of sight across the sea. That line mattered because it was fragile. Gallen Head was on Lewis. Eilean Mor lay to the west. Out among the Flannan Isles, the group also known as the Seven Hunters. National Records of Scotland gives the distance as 21 miles west of Lewis, while Northern Lighthouse Board historical text describes the observer's line from Gallen Head as 18 miles northwest. Either way, the principle was the same. The light was not being checked by a cable or a wireless set or a spoken exchange with the men in the tower. It was being checked by vision over open water. In clear conditions, a lighthouse exists to be seen. Its whole purpose is distance. It takes oil, glass, iron, masonry, and routine and turns them into a visible warning. But an observer system reverses the meaning of that visibility. The beam is not only for ships at sea, it is also proof that the station is alive. If the beam is seen, the system assumes the work continues. The men are not heard from, but their labor is implied. The apparatus has been tended. The lamp has been kept. The routine has not failed. In that sense, every visible flash is a kind of silent report. If the beam is not seen, the meaning becomes less certain. A missing light might mean a failure at the lighthouse. It might mean weather between the observer and the island. It might mean an error in watching, or a delay in reporting, or some other interruption in the chain of notice. The absence of light is not as simple as the presence of light. It has to be interpreted. And in December 1900, interpretation took time. Roderick Mackenzie's role at Gallen Head shows how official safety could still depend on the most exposed and human forms of attention. He was not receiving a signal from the keepers. He was looking for a light across a difficult sea. His report, when required, would not go straight from Eilean Mor to help. It would go from Lewis by telegram. The message would travel away from the island into the communications network of the mainland administration before any practical response could be organized. This is one of the quiet tensions at the center of the Flannan case. The lighthouse was built as a machine of certainty. It stood on the highest point of Eilean Mor. Its buildings, landings, and stairs had been constructed to serve a defined maritime purpose. The men were appointed, recorded, rotated, and supplied. The shore station at Breescleet connected their working lives to families and relief logistics on Lewis. Yet the knowledge of an emergency could not originate directly from the keepers themselves. The men could be in trouble, and the first official sign might still be nothing more than darkness where a light was expected. There is a difference between being connected and being observed. Flannan was observed. The distinction matters. A connected station can send a condition outward: fire, injury, damage, illness, failure. An observed station can only be judged from what it appears to be doing. From Lewis, the question was not, what have the keepers reported? It was, is the light showing? That question was useful, but narrow. It could tell the shore that the lighthouse was not performing its visible duty. It could not tell why. It could not say whether the lamp had failed, whether the men were incapacitated, whether the weather had intervened, whether an accident had already occurred outside the tower, or whether the station was simply hidden from view. The observer's evidence began with appearance. The archive would have to build everything else from later traces. This is why the communication system made the disappearance so dangerous. The hazard was not only that the Flannan Isles were remote, it was that the island's need for help had to be inferred. A lighthouse keeper on Eilean Mor could not call across to Breescleet. He could not send a spoken warning to Lewis. He could not explain that a landing had been damaged, or that the weather had worsened, or that one man had gone missing, or that the light could not be maintained. The station's emergency language was indirect: a beam or no beam, and even that depended on conditions beyond the island. Sightlines across the Minch and the Atlantic approaches are not fixed instruments. They belong to weather, darkness, distance, and the discipline of watching. Fog, rain, storm, and sea haze can alter what is visible. The observer may be appointed, but the atmosphere is not obedient. A system based on watching has to trust not only the person assigned to watch, but also the possibility that there will be something to see. At Flannan, this weakness sat beside another. Relief itself depended on the sea. The tender could not always land. Loch Rogue offered shelter near Brisklet when reliefs could not be carried out, but shelter was not the same as access. The lighthouse had been designed with landings and stairs because the island demanded them, yet those same landings remained subject to weather and swell. A message might travel by telegram, but men and supplies still had to cross water. So the chain looked orderly on paper, but every link had exposure in it. The keepers maintained the light on Eilean Mor. The observer watched from Gallen Head. A failure could be reported by telegram. The shore station at Brisklet supported the relief system. The tender Hesperus could carry men across when conditions permitted. The commissioners of northern lighthouses could receive reports and act through the structures available to them. But the first link was still a visual fact. The light had to be seen or not seen. This arrangement also shaped the later mystery in a very specific way. The absence of radio meant there was no final transmitted sentence from James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, or Donald MacArthur. No official record preserves a direct warning from beneath the tower, from the landings, from the kitchen, from the light room, or from the stairs. What survives is not a voice from the men at the moment of crisis, but a sequence of administrative and physical traces, a reported failure, a delayed relief, an empty station, prepared lamps, cleaned machinery, missing outdoor clothing, slate readings, and later reports. The story is therefore not built from a dramatic last call. It is built from the lack of one. That lack can be easy to romanticize, but in the archive it is more practical than theatrical. It means the men's last known circumstances have to be approached through systems: how light was checked, how relief was organized, how reports moved, and how silence was recognized. The lighthouse did not vanish from record because nobody cared. It vanished into a gap between observation and response. Roderick Mackenzie's appointed watch from Gallen Head reminds us that someone was meant to be looking. The arrangement acknowledged the danger. It did not ignore the island. It created a procedure for failure, but the procedure could only begin when failure became visible from somewhere else. That is the strange inversion of a lighthouse without radio. The keepers were responsible for warning ships away from danger, but their own danger could only be detected if the warning itself stopped. The same beam that protected others was the proof that they were still at work. When that proof failed, the message did not come from Eilean Mor. It came from outside the island, from eyes and reports beyond the rock. In the record, the first clear fracture was not a shouted alarm and not a wireless distress call. It was a report that, around midnight on 15 December 1900, a passing steamer had found the Flannan Light dark when it should have been burning. The report arrived from outside the system that had been designed to watch Eilean Mor. It did not come from the keepers. It did not come from a radio room, because there was no radio link between Flannan and Lewis. It did not come from the island itself in any direct form. It came by way of a vessel passing through the dark, noticing the absence of a light that should have been part of the night's fixed order. Around midnight on 15 December 1900, a passing steamer reported that the Flannan Light was not operating. In later retellings, that moment is sometimes given the weight of a distress signal. But in the surviving record, its force is quieter and more procedural. A lighthouse was expected to burn. Its absence was not, at first, a scene. It was a failure in a chain of public safety, a mark against routine, a fact to be carried onward. National Records of Scotland identifies the vessel connected with that first report as SS Archtor under Captain Holman. That detail matters because it gives the first warning a name, a route through the archive, and a human officer responsible for what was seen. The dark lighthouse was not merely a rumor coming ashore from bad weather and distance. It was attached to a ship, a captain, and a time, around midnight, 15 December. The date would later become one of the fixed points in the disappearance. It was the day on or about which the missing men, James Ducat and Thomas Marshall, were later noted in service records as having disappeared. It was also the day marked by the last slate readings inside the station, according to National Records of Scotland, readings that had not yet been transferred into the formal log. But Captain Holman and SS Archtor did not know that. The steamer's report was made from the outside, from the ordinary world of navigation, where a lighthouse was either visible or it was not. To understand the significance of that warning, it helps to hold back from imagining panic. A ship at sea could not simply cross the distance to the tower and resolve the question. The Flannan Isles stood west of Lewis, and Eilean Mor rose out of water that made every approach dependent on sea and weather. The lighthouse itself had been built to warn vessels from afar, not to invite them in. Its beam was the message ships were meant to receive. When that beam failed, the ship became the observer. This was the first inversion in the record. The station meant to report danger to mariners became, through its silence, a danger reported by mariners. There is a discipline in the way lighthouse records must be read. They often preserve consequences before causes. A lamp is out. A telegram is sent. A vessel is delayed. A keeper finds a room empty. The emotional story comes later, when those fragments are arranged around the missing men. But at the moment of the steamer's warning, the fact was still narrow. The Flannan light, which should have been visible, was not burning. That narrowness is important. It kept the official trail from beginning as legend. No one aboard SS Archtor could have reported the condition of the kitchen, the state of the lens, the outdoor clothing, or the later damage found at the West Landing. Those details belong to a future search scene. At midnight on 15 December, the only known evidence from the passing vessel was absence. The expected light was absent. A lighthouse beam is not just illumination. In an administrative sense, it is confirmation that the station is functioning. It confirms that oil, machinery, lenses, and human routine are all aligned. It confirms that the men on duty have carried the night from one watch to the next. It confirms that the isolation designed into the station has not broken the service it was meant to protect. When the Flannan light was seen dark, all those confirmations failed at once. But a failed light did not automatically explain itself. It could suggest mechanical trouble. It could suggest weather conditions affecting observation. It could suggest a temporary problem at the station. In the conditions of 1900, and especially in a station without direct wireless communication, certainty could not be pulled quickly from the island. It had to be approached. And the approach depended on the same sea that the lighthouse had been built to guard. That is why the steamer's warning sits in the record with such unease. It is the first clear sign, but not yet an answer. It opens a gap rather than closing one. The observer system on Lewis, with Roderick Mackenzie watching from Gallon Head and failures to be reported by telegram, shows that the Northern Lighthouse authorities understood the need for distant surveillance. But a passing vessel added another kind of witness, not a fixed watcher on shore, but a moving point in the maritime world. SS Archtor was not stationed to watch Flannan. It encountered the failure as part of passage. Its report entered the official chain because the darkness mattered to navigation. This is one of the reasons the Flannan case remains anchored in official traces rather than in a single dramatic scene. The first alarm was not a keeper's cry. It was a mariner's observation. The light was out. In ordinary circumstances, the sight of an extinguished lighthouse would demand attention because the system relied on trust. Mariners did not approach these coasts by guesswork alone. They used fixed lights, known positions, and expected characteristics. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse had only recently entered that network. Built after Board of Trade sanction in 1896 and first lit in 1899, it was still a new station in December 1900. Its absence from the night was therefore not an old irregularity. It was a failure of a recently established mark. The tower on Eilean Mor had been placed on the island's highest point for visibility. Its purpose was to project certainty across distance. From the sea, the men inside it were invisible, but their work was not. The beam stood in for them. It told every passing ship that the station was alive. SS Archtor's report reversed that relationship. The ship could not see Ducat, Marshall, or MacArthur. It could only see that the sign of their labor had vanished. There is a temptation to read that moment as if it already contains the whole mystery. 3 men gone, a lighthouse prepared, a damaged landing, death registers later noting probable drowning. But the archive does not unfold that way. On 15 December, the known record had not yet reached the lighthouse door. It had not climbed the stairs. It had not inspected the west landing. It had not found the cleaned machinery or the trimmed lamps. It had only registered that a public light was not showing. That makes the steamer's warning both modest and severe. Modest, because it states so little. Severe, because everything that followed had to begin from it. The language around such a report would have belonged to administration as much as to fear. A light not operating was a matter for notification, for authority, for remedy. It would need to be communicated inland and onward through the available channels, because the lighthouse service had to know when one of its marks had failed. In this case, however, communication did not shorten the distance to the men. It only confirmed that something needed to be checked. Between the sighting and the checking lay weather, water, and procedure. The geography of Flannan made any response practical only when a vessel could reach the island and make a landing. The relief system connected Eilean Mor with Breskleet on Lewis, with Loch Rogue providing anchorage and shelter for the lighthouse tender when conditions prevented a crossing or landing. The station was not a place that could be entered on command. It was a place that permitted entry when the sea allowed it. So the first warning did not become an immediate discovery. The darkness seen by SS Archtor had to wait for a physical arrival. It had to wait for the Hesperus, for the relief route, for a break in conditions that would allow men to get ashore and climb toward the tower. That delay is where the mystery widened. The report fixed the first public sign of failure around midnight on 15 December. But the island itself remained out of reach. The keepers, if they were already gone, were beyond help. If some other explanation existed, it could not yet be tested. Each day that passed turned a failure of light into a deeper absence. The steamer's warning therefore stands as the first administrative fracture in the Flannan record. Not a final message from the keepers, and not a dramatic transmission from beneath the stairs, but a negative signal written across the sea. The light that should have been burning was not there. From that point, the record begins to stretch. A single observation becomes a span of days. The distance between seeing the light out and entering the station becomes the next critical fact. The warning had been given. The island still had not answered. The warning had been given. The island still had not answered. That is the point where the Flannan record becomes especially difficult to read, not because it suddenly fills with dramatic evidence, but because it does the opposite. It opens into delay. The light had been reported out around midnight on 15 December 1900. The relief vessel Hesperus did not reach Eilean Mor until 26 December. Between those two dates lay 11 days in which the central fact could not be inspected. For a modern listener, that delay can feel almost impossible. A lighthouse has gone dark. 3 men are stationed there. Why was no one immediately at the door? But the question belongs partly to another age of communication, and partly to the weather and geography of the outer Hebrides. Flannan was not a station joined to its shore by a line, a radio, or a road. It was a rock group west of Lewis, reached by sea when the sea allowed it. The system could observe failure, report failure, and send a vessel. It could not make Eilean Mor accessible on command. The relief system had been built around that limitation. The keepers' family dwellings were not on Eilean Mor. They were at the Breskleet shore station on the Isle of Lewis, near Loch Rogue. That arrangement tells us something important about the working life of the station. The lighthouse itself was a place of duty, not a family settlement. Men went out to it in rotation. Others remained ashore. Stores, reliefs, and instructions moved through a chain that depended on the lighthouse tender and on conditions at sea. Breskleet mattered because it was the human side of the station. It was where the families and shore arrangements were placed, and where the rhythm of relief had its landward point. Loch Rogue mattered because it offered anchorage and shelter for the tender when reliefs could not be carried out. These were not decorative details in the landscape. They were part of the operating design. The lighthouse was remote enough that even its connection to shore had to include waiting places. The Hesperus was the vessel in that chain. In ordinary conditions, a relief voyage might have been procedural, the tender leaving shelter, approaching the islands, making a landing if possible, exchanging men, mail, stores, and news, then returning the relieved keeper to shore. In that kind of system, routine was safety. Everyone knew what should happen, and the expectation of regular changeover made absence visible. But weather could turn the same routine into silence. The archive record does not allow us to fill those 11 days with imagined scenes inside the lighthouse. It does not tell us that the keepers wrote secret messages, heard omens, or waited helplessly beneath the tower stairs. It tells us something colder and more practical. Bad weather delayed the Hesperus until 26 December. That delay is not a side note. It is one of the facts that made the mystery widen. The first report fixed a point in time. Around midnight on 15 December, a passing steamer saw that the Flannan Light was not operating. National Records of Scotland identifies that vessel as SS Archtor, under Captain Holman. But a report from a passing ship could not determine why the light was out. It could not tell whether the lamp had failed, whether the men were ill, whether some accident had occurred, or whether the observation itself would be explained by some technical or atmospheric complication. The report could only begin the administrative response. To test the warning, someone had to reach the station. That was the hard boundary. Eilean Mor was visible from a distance under the right conditions, watched as part of a safety chain from Lewis, but seeing and landing were different acts. The lighthouse stood high on the island. The men who worked there maintained a tower built to project its beam far across the water. Yet the physical approach still depended on landings, sea state, and the ability of a vessel to put men ashore safely. The design of the station included landing places and island stairs for precisely that reason. Even with engineering, the final movement from ship to rock remained exposed. In the official and heritage record, the number that follows the warning is therefore not merely a date interval. 11 days means 11 days in which no one could examine the lamp, read the log, check the living quarters, inspect the landings, or confirm the whereabouts of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. It means that if evidence existed in weather, water, footprints, unsecured gear, or the immediate condition of the approaches, time and storm had the opportunity to alter it before any investigator stood on the island. That is why the delay matters so much to the later reconstruction. When Joseph Moore eventually entered the lighthouse, he would find an orderly station rather than a scene that explained itself. When Robert Muirhead later wrote his report, the strongest physical evidence would come not from a discovered body or a direct statement by one of the men, but from damage at the West Landing. The record would have to work backward from what survived. The 11-day gap helped ensure that the case would never become complete. It also reminds us that the disappearance was not first experienced as a legend. It was experienced as a failure in a working maritime system. A light was reported out. A relief was due. A tender was delayed. The station could not speak. The weather held the vessel back. Those are administrative facts, but they carry their own pressure. In the life of a lighthouse service, delay was not unusual. Reliefs could be obstructed by sea and weather. The existence of Loch Roeg as shelter for the tender acknowledges that such interruptions were expected. What made this delay different was what lay at its far end. Onshore, the distinction between routine delay and emergency would have been painfully uncertain. The families and relief arrangements were tied to Brisklet, but Brisklet could not resolve the question by itself. The observer system could tell whether the light was visible when conditions permitted. Telegrams could send information away from Lewis. The Northern Lighthouse Commissioners could be informed, but none of those mechanisms could open the lighthouse door. The gap remained physical. This is one of the quietest forms of isolation in the Flannan case. It was not only that the keepers were alone while on duty. It was that, once something appeared to be wrong, the outside world also became powerless for a time. The steamer's report made the absence known, but knowledge did not immediately become access. The island sat beyond the reach of certainty. The phrase 11-day gap can sound like a neat historical label, as if it were simply a blank between two dated entries. In practice, it shaped the whole evidential problem. The last clear external warning came from the sea. The first direct inspection would come only after the sea allowed it. Between those points, the record offers no voice from the men and no direct witness from the island. It leaves only the known structure of the service, the shore station at Brisklet, the anchorage of Loch Roeg, the lighthouse tender Hesperus, the exposed landings of Eilean Mor, and the weather that could interrupt the chain. Care is needed here, because silence invites invention. Later tellings often use the gap as a space for imagined fear. Meals abandoned, chairs overturned, messages hidden, some final human signal from beneath the stairs. The archive material supplied in the official record is more restrained. It does not give us a dramatic transmission. It gives us absence, delay, and then inspection. The closest surviving traces would be ordinary working records and physical conditions, not a confession of what happened. That restraint does not make the story less unsettling. It makes it more exact. For 11 days, the most important place in the case was inaccessible. The light that should have spoken nightly over the water was dark. The men assigned to keep it burning could not be reached. The relief vessel that might have answered the question was held away by weather. The machinery of response existed, but it could only move as far as the sea permitted. By 26 December 1900, the delay ended. Hesperus was finally able to reach Eilean Mor. The long uncertainty narrowed into an approach, a landing attempt, and the first visible signs from the island itself. What had been a reported absence was about to become a physical one. Captain Harvey brought the vessel in expecting the ordinary signals of a manned station. Instead, above the landings, the lighthouse stood waiting without any sign of life. By 26 December 1900, the delay ended not with an explanation, but with an approach. Hesperus had crossed the water that bad weather had kept closed, and Eilean Mor came back into reach as a physical place rather than a distant point of uncertainty. The report of the dark light had already traveled through the administrative chain. The question now moved from telegrams and observation to the island itself. If the men were there, they should be visible and some part of the routine that surrounded a relief. Captain Harvey brought Hesperus toward the Flannan Isles, expecting the signs of a manned station. That expectation matters because a lighthouse relief was not an improvised visit. It was part of a working pattern. Men on the island knew when a tender was due. The tender carried the relief keeper and supplies. The keepers ashore and afloat knew the practical language of arrival, the vessel coming in, the landing chosen according to weather and sea, the visible movement of men preparing to receive stores, the small confirmations that human order still held on an exposed rock. At Eilean Mor, those confirmations did not appear. Captain Harvey reported no sign of life on the island. The phrase is plain, but in the circumstances, it is one of the most important observations in the case. It does not describe a theory. It does not assign a cause. It records an absence at the moment when presence should have been easiest to detect. The Hesperus was not passing at a distance like the steamer that had first reported the dark light. It was the relief vessel, arriving at the station itself. It had reason to look closely. It had reason to expect an answer. The ship's horn was sounded. No one responded. A rocket was fired. Still, there was no response. In another setting, those details might feel theatrical. In the Flannan record, they are procedural. The horn and the rocket were not symbols. They were practical calls across dangerous ground and water. They were meant to announce the vessel, to draw attention, to confirm that the men on the rock were able to act. If the keepers were occupied inside the tower, the sound should have reached them. If they were near the buildings, the signal should have brought them out. If they were at one of the landings, it should have been noticed immediately. Nothing came back. That silence had a different quality from the earlier silence. Before Hesperus reached the island, the silence could still be explained by distance and weather. There was no radio link between Flannan and Lewis, so the keepers had no direct way to speak from Eilean Mor. A failure of the light might be seen from elsewhere, but the men themselves could not send a message across the sea. The island's isolation had always been part of the design. Now the vessel was close enough to call, close enough to watch, close enough for the expected routines of the station to show themselves. The silence was no longer only a feature of the communication system. It was visible on the island. Above the landings, the lighthouse remained. That contrast is at the center of this stage of the case. The buildings did not look erased. The tower was still there on the high ground of Eilean Mor, part of the station built only recently in the history of the island. The landing places, stairs, and working routes that had been made for lighthouse service were still fixed into the rock. The physical apparatus of watchkeeping remained in place. What was missing was the human movement that made the apparatus meaningful. A lighthouse station was not only a tower and lantern. It was a chain of repeated actions. Keepers trimmed lamps, cleaned machinery, recorded readings, watched weather, prepared for relief, moved between the tower, the dwelling spaces, and the landings when work required it. The station's safety depended on those actions continuing in order. On a relief day, the ordinary pattern should have expanded outward toward the tender. Men would be expected to appear, to signal, to help with the landing, to make the difficult exchange between vessel and island possible. Instead, Hesperus faced a station that seemed to be waiting, but not answering. The setting sharpened that impression. Eilean Mor is the largest of the Flannan Isles, also known as the Seven Hunters, lying west of Lewis in the outer Hebrides. The lighthouse stands on the island's highest point. From the sea, the station was not hidden in an urban landscape or masked by surrounding activity. It occupied a severe, exposed place where the presence of even a few people could matter visually. A keeper appearing on a path, a figure moving near a landing, a signal from the buildings, each would have carried significance. Captain Harvey saw none of it. The report does not require embellishment. Its power is in the discipline of what it says and does not say. It does not describe cries, wreckage, or a final note. It records an approach to a manned lighthouse where the men did not show themselves. It records practical attempts to summon them. It records failure. In an archive report, that is the moment when uncertainty becomes structured. The absence is no longer broad or atmospheric. It is attached to specific acts: arrival, observation, horn, rocket, no reply. For the crew of Hesperus, this must also have changed the meaning of the landing. A routine relief had become an investigation before anyone had set foot inside the station. The tender had not arrived merely to exchange men and supplies. It had arrived at a place where the normal signals of life had stopped. The work ahead would have to be done carefully, not because the archive gives us dramatic details of fear or panic, but because the facts themselves demanded caution. An island that did not answer still had to be entered. A lighthouse that stood intact still had to be searched. There is an important restraint here. The arrival of Hesperus did not solve the question of when the keepers disappeared, or how. It did not establish whether the decisive event had occurred on the night the light was first reported out, or earlier that day, or at another point within the gap that the weather had opened. It did not identify a cause. It only closed one category of possibility. By the time Captain Harvey came in on 26 December, the men were not visibly performing their duties, not answering ship signals, and not presenting themselves for relief. The station, however, had not yet been examined from within. That distinction matters because the Flannan mystery has often been retold as if the island itself immediately announced a complete story. The records are quieter than that. First came the sighting of a dark light. Then the delay. Then the arrival of Hesperus. Then the failure of sound and signal to produce a response. Each step narrowed the field, but each step also preserved uncertainty. The island did not speak in one complete message. It yielded fragments in order. At this point, the physical arrangement of Eilean Mor becomes more than background. The lighthouse had been built with routes between sea level and the station because every relief depended on them. The landing places and stairs connected the tender's world to the keeper's world. They were the channels through which men, supplies, equipment, and information moved. When Hesperus arrived and found no one waiting there, the absence was not just emotional. It was operational. The system had reached the point where the shore side of the exchange should have begun, and that side was missing. The horn and rocket also revealed the limits of certainty. They show that Hesperus attempted to attract attention before the search began. They show that if any keeper was present and able to respond, no response was detected. But they do not tell us what had happened inside the tower. They do not tell us whether the rooms were in disorder or calm, whether the light room showed neglect or preparation, whether the men had left suddenly or in the course of a task. Those answers, as far as the archive can provide them, lay beyond the threshold. So the scene on 26 December holds in a suspended state. The lighthouse stood above the landings, built for endurance, built for warning, built to turn human labor into a dependable beam. The relief vessel lay below, sounding for men who should have been there. The island gave back no human sign. It was not yet the famous interior of trimmed lamps and cleaned machinery. It was not yet the record of outdoor clothing missing for 2 men. It was the moment before those details were known, when the station's outward silence had to be tested by entry. The next movement belonged to relief keeper Joseph Mor. He had come with Hesperus as part of the ordinary changeover, but the absence on the island had already changed the nature of his task. The horn had failed. The rocket had failed. Captain Harvey had seen no life. The only remaining way to ask the station what had happened was to go up from the landing, reach the buildings, and open the lighthouse from within. The only remaining way to ask the station what had happened was to enter it. Joseph Moore had arrived with Hesperus as a relief keeper, part of the ordinary machinery of rotation that kept Flannan Isles Lighthouse alive. But by the time he went up from the landing, the relief had already become a search. Captain Harvey had reported no sign of life. The horn had brought no answer. The rocket had brought no answer. The island, which should have shown some small human movement in response to the vessel below, remained still. Moore's route from the landing to the lighthouse was not simply a walk toward a building. On Eilean Mor, the lighthouse stood high above the sea, on the largest of the Flannan Isles, with its tower raised on the island's highest point. The men who built the station had given the island landing places and stairs because access itself was one of the central problems of the place. Relief keepers, supplies, equipment, and messages all had to pass between vessel and rock before they could reach the working rooms of the light. That day, Moore was moving through a system designed for difficult arrivals. Yet the difficulty before him was no longer only weather or terrain. It was the unnatural absence of a working crew at a manned station. When Moore reached the lighthouse buildings and entered, he became the first person to test the silence from within. The fact that he found the station deserted is one of the firm points in the Flannan record. Principal keeper James Ducat was not there. Assistant lightkeeper Thomas Marshall was not there. Occasional keeper Donald MacArthur was not there. No one came down to meet the relief. No one appeared in the rooms. No explanation was waiting in any form that immediately resolved the missing men. But the state of the lighthouse did not match the most dramatic versions that later gathered around the case. The confirmed findings point toward order, not domestic chaos. The station was in working condition. The lamps were trimmed and ready. The lens and machinery had been cleaned. The kitchen was tidied. Outdoor clothing was missing for 2 men. These details are quiet, but they are not minor. In lighthouse work, order was not decoration. It was the substance of the duty. The light was maintained by repeated acts: trimming, cleaning, checking, recording, preparing. A lighthouse could not be allowed to become merely a building with a lamp inside it. It had to be kept ready, night after night, by men who understood that small failures could become danger at sea. So the trimmed lamps mattered. They suggested that, at some point before the station fell silent, the apparatus had been left in a state of readiness. The cleaned lens and machinery mattered for the same reason. They belonged to a routine that had not obviously collapsed into panic or disorder. The kitchen being tidied mattered because it placed the ordinary domestic side of the station in the same pattern as the technical side. The workspaces and living spaces did not present, in the confirmed account, as rooms abandoned after a violent disruption inside the tower. This is why Moore's discovery is so unsettling in the archive record. It is not unsettling because every object was strange. It is unsettling because so much was normal. A deserted station with broken equipment might have pointed immediately toward one kind of event. A room in visible disarray might have pointed toward another. But Moore found a lighthouse that still carried the imprint of competent keeping. The human presence had vanished, while the habits of that presence remained arranged around the rooms. The tower itself becomes important here, not as a theatrical setting, but as evidence of the kind of place the men had occupied. Historic Environment Scotland records the lighthouse as a whitewashed rubble tower, with a single-story keeper's house clasping its base. Inside was a serpentine cast-iron staircase with a timber handrail. That staircase linked the domestic and working levels, the life of the keepers below with the lantern and machinery above. It was a practical spine through the tower, built for ascent, inspection, and return. To imagine Moore inside that structure is to imagine a man moving through a place that should have answered him through signs of occupation. The stairs should have led to men at work or at rest. The rooms should have contained the ordinary evidence of a crew between watches. Instead, the cast-iron staircase, the cleaned machinery, the prepared lamps, and the tidied kitchen all belonged to a station that had been maintained and then suddenly left without its keepers. The absence of outdoor clothing for 2 men became one of the most consequential details. It did not solve the case by itself, but it helped shape how the official inquiry would later think about the direction of events. Clothing at a lighthouse was not incidental. On an exposed island west of Lewis, where landings, crane platforms, tramway fittings, concrete paths, and sea-swept approaches formed part of the working landscape, outdoor clothing marked a boundary between the sheltered interior and the dangerous outside. The record says outdoor clothing was missing for 2 men. It does not say that all 3 men's clothing was missing. That distinction would matter. Later, Robert Muirhead would use Mor's knowledge of the keeper's habits to help infer that Ducat and Marshall had gone out, likely toward the landing area or nearby exposed ground. The detail did not create certainty, but it gave investigators a way to connect the interior condition of the station with the exterior evidence that would be examined at the West Landing. At this stage, however, Mor's first search did not yet have the full shape of the official theory. It had only the interior facts and the absence. The lighthouse was empty. The men were gone. The equipment was prepared. The domestic room was tidied. Clothing was missing for 2 men. The light, previously reported out around midnight on 15 December 1900, had not been kept burning as required. And yet the place did not appear to have been abandoned through prolonged disorder inside the buildings. That contradiction is central to the mystery. The station's orderly condition narrows the imagination and makes some scenes less likely and others more pressing. It draws attention away from a long collapse inside the tower and toward a sudden interruption of routine. The men had been doing their work. The station bore the signs of maintenance. Then, somewhere between routine and relief, the system stopped. For an archive report, Mor's entry into the lighthouse is one of the moments when legend must be held back most carefully. Over time, the Flannan disappearance has attracted images that are powerful, but not secure as official evidence. The overturned chair, the half-eaten meal, the atmosphere of a room abandoned in a single instant, these belong strongly to later literary and popular retellings, especially the influence of Wilfred Wilson Gibson's poem. They are not the stable ground of the record presented here. The stable ground is plainer, and in some ways more disturbing. A lighthouse built to impose order on darkness was found in order, except for the one fact that undid everything: the keepers were gone. Mor's search changed the problem facing Captain Harvey and the Northern Lighthouse authorities. Before entry, the concern had been that the men were not responding. After entry, the fact was that the station was deserted. The failure of the light was no longer only an observation from a passing steamer or a concern carried through delayed relief logistics. It was now attached to rooms, tools, clothing, machinery, and human absence. The interior gave no final confession. It did not present a note of farewell or a clear account of what had happened. Instead, it preserved the shape of work interrupted. The lamps were ready. The lens was clean. The machinery was clean. The kitchen had been put in order. This was not a place that explained itself loudly. It was a place that forced investigators to read ordinary things as evidence. That is the difficult discipline of the Flannan record. It asks us to pay attention not to spectacle, but to maintenance. A trimmed lamp is an action left behind. A cleaned lens is an action left behind. A missing coat is an action implied, but not seen. A tidied kitchen is the residue of routine. Each detail belongs to the life of a working lighthouse, yet each becomes strange because the men who made those details meaningful are absent. Inside the tower, the most important messages were not dramatic transmissions. They were working traces. The building had been cared for. The light had been prepared. The keepers had not returned. And beneath that surface of order lay another layer of evidence, quieter still, the written routine of the station where log entries and temporary readings recorded the last administrative movements before silence. The search that began with Mor's entry would soon turn from rooms and clothing to the marks left for later transfer on the slate beneath the routine. The search that began with rooms and clothing led inward towards something less visible than an open door or a missing coat. It led to routine itself. At a lighthouse station, routine was not background. It was the structure that made the light trustworthy. The machinery had to be cleaned. The lamps had to be prepared. The keepers had to watch weather, sea, and signal. And the work had to be written down, because a lighthouse did not exist only as a tower on rock. It also existed as a record. For Flannan Isles Lighthouse, the last surviving operational traces are not a farewell in the ordinary sense. They are not a confession. They are not a warning carved into a wall. They are not the kind of message that later retellings often seem to want from an unsolved disappearance. According to National Records of Scotland, the last entries made in the official log were for 13 December 1900. Readings for 14 December and 15 December had not yet been transferred into that log. They were noted instead on a slate, waiting for later copying. That distinction is small, but it matters. A logbook belongs to the completed record. A slate belongs to the working moment. It is temporary, practical, and close to the hand. It holds figures or notes until someone has time to put them where they officially belong. In that sense, the slate at Flannan was not separate from the station's discipline. It was part of it. It shows that the lighthouse's administrative routine had continued beyond the last formal log entry. The official book stopped at 13 December, but the working system had not stopped there. Someone had still been taking readings. Someone had still been preserving them for transfer. The station had not fallen instantly into neglect. This is why the slate becomes one of the quietest and most important objects in the story. It is the closest thing the record gives us to a final message from inside the lighthouse, but its meaning lies in how ordinary it is. It does not cry out. It does not interpret the danger. It does not say where James Duquette, Thomas Marshall, or Donald MacArthur went. It simply carries forward the expectation that there would be a later moment, a normal moment, when temporary notes would be copied neatly into the permanent log. The power of that expectation is what makes the object unsettling. The slate assumes continuity. The men would return to the book. The readings would be entered. The routine would close its own loop. Instead, the loop remained open. National Records of Scotland identifies the relevant Northern Lighthouse Commissioners' material among the surviving records of the administration that managed stations like Flannan. These are the kinds of records in which a mystery becomes less theatrical and more exacting. They do not give us a scene of panic. They give us dates, omissions, duties, and the sharp edge of interrupted paperwork. The last full log entries stood at 13 December. The readings for 14 December and 15 December waited on the slate. After that, the known interior record gives way to absence. The dates also sit beside the first outside warning. A passing steamer, identified in National Records of Scotland records as SS Archtor under Captain Holman, reported that the Flannan Light was not operating around midnight on 15 December 1900. The slate therefore belongs to the same narrow period as the first known failure of the light. It does not solve that timing, but it brings the interior record close to the exterior alarm. Outside, a vessel saw darkness where the light should have been. Inside, the station still held working notes connected with the same date. That is not enough to reconstruct the final hours. It is enough to define the boundary of knowledge. The formal log had been maintained up to 13 December. The temporary slate carried the routine through 14 December and 15 December. The light was reported out around midnight on 15 December. When Hesperus finally reached Eilean Mor on 26 December, Joseph Moore found the station deserted, but not wrecked internally. The lamps were trimmed and ready. The lens and machinery were cleaned. The kitchen was tidied. Outdoor clothing was missing for 2 men. These details do not explain one another automatically, but they point in the same general direction. The last recoverable signs inside the station are signs of work, not collapse. A lighthouse log was not a private diary. It was not meant to reveal the inner life of the keepers. It was a professional instrument, part of a chain that connected the island to the Northern Lighthouse Commissioners and to the wider system of maritime safety. The keepers at Flannan were men on duty, not characters leaving clues for a future audience. Principal keeper James Duquette, assistant lightkeeper Thomas Marshall, and occasional keeper Donald MacArthur were attached to a station built for service, relief, and isolation. Their records, where they survive, are service records, operational notes, administrative reports, and death register entries. The slate belongs to that same world. That is one reason the slate should be handled carefully. It can tempt the imagination because it is incomplete. It sits at the point where ordinary notation meets permanent silence. But the archive does not support turning it into a coded warning or a dramatic last statement. Its importance is not that it says something extraordinary. Its importance is that it says something ordinary at the last possible edge of the record. In a mystery shaped by missing bodies and delayed discovery, ordinary things carry unusual weight. The slate tells us that measurements were being gathered for the log. It tells us that at least some part of the station's expected daily discipline continued after 13 December. It suggests no known quarrel, no confirmed terror, no written anticipation of disaster. It is evidence of maintenance, and maintenance is the central contradiction of the interior scene. The lighthouse appears to have been cared for by men, who then vanished before the care could be completed. There is also a difference between a silence caused by lack of communication and a silence found inside a document. Flannan had no radio link to Lewis. That absence had already shaped the wider story. If the keepers needed help, there was no simple way to call directly across the sea. Roderick Mackenzie could watch the light from Gallon Head and report failures by telegram, but that system depended on visibility and observation from outside the island. The slate is different. It is not an attempted message leaving Eilean Mor. It is an internal note intended for the station's own record. It was not sent because it was never meant to be sent. It remained where the work remained. That makes the phrase final message both useful and dangerous. Useful because the slate is one of the last human marks tied to the operation of the station. Dangerous because it can imply intention where none is proven. The keepers did not write a last message in the dramatic sense preserved by fiction. What survived was a working note. Its finality was created later by the fact that no one came back to complete the transfer. The slate also narrows the emotional tone of the case. It pulls the story away from legend and back into procedure. Instead of imagining a sudden tableau frozen in fear, we are left with an administrative interruption. The log was current to 13 December. Readings existed for 14 December and 15 December. Then the maintenance of the record stopped. In many disappearances, the last known trace is a letter, a ticket, a witness statement, or a distress call. At Flannan, it is closer to a clerical gap. The temporary figures never became the permanent entry. And yet that gap is not empty. It marks the exact place where the human system failed to continue. Someone had intended that the slate would not remain the final form. Someone expected the later act of copying. That expectation is preserved more clearly than any explanation. The slate says, in effect, that the day's work was still inside a process. It had not yet been closed, signed into the ordinary past, and absorbed into the station's official memory. When Robert Muirhead and the Northern Lighthouse Commissioners later examined what had happened, such details mattered because they established the condition of the station before attention turned outward. The interior did not offer evidence of a long struggle. It offered order and incompletion. The official question, therefore, moved beyond the rooms, beyond the log, beyond the slate, toward the places where routine met exposure, the landings, the crane platform, the tramway terminus, the steps, the railings, and the sea. The slate remains beneath the routine because it belongs to the quietest layer of the evidence. It is not the beam seen from miles away, and it is not the damaged iron at the shore. It is the station speaking in its own administrative language, up to the point where that language stopped. The final mark inside was not a cry for rescue. It was a note for later. And when later came, it came without the men who were supposed to write it into the book. From there, the investigation could no longer remain inside the orderly tower. The slate had shown interruption, not cause. To search for cause, the record had to descend again from the lighthouse to the edge of the island, where the west landing bore marks that were not quiet at all. From the quiet marks inside the lighthouse, the record turns outward to the places where the station met the sea. The slate had preserved routine. The west landing preserved force. It was not a message written by the keepers, and it was not a direct witness to their last movements, but it gave the official inquiry something the rooms could not give: physical damage in the open, where men, equipment, stone, iron, and Atlantic weather came together. By the time Robert Muirhead made his report on 8 January 1901, the disappearance had already passed through several stages of official recognition. The light had been reported out. Hesperus had reached Eilean Mor. Joseph Moore had entered the deserted station. The tower had been found in working order, with lamps trimmed and ready, the lens and machinery cleaned, and the kitchen tidied. The last log entries and slate readings had fixed the final known administrative traces. But none of those details by themselves explained why James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur did not return. Muirhead's attention therefore moved to the ground outside, and particularly to the West Landing. On an island such as Eilean Mor, a landing was never simply an entrance. It was part of the lighthouse system. Men and supplies had to be brought from the sea to the station. Gear had to be landed, lifted, hauled, and secured. The terrain between shore and tower was as much a working environment as the lightroom itself. It had its own objects, its own pathways, and its own risks. Steps, railings, a crane platform, and a tramway terminus near the place where the movement from boat to land became movement toward the lighthouse. The West Landing stood at the edge of that system. It was one of the places where ordinary lightkeeping crossed into exposure. In calm conditions, a landing could be a route. In heavy weather, it could become evidence of impact. Muirhead's report described storm damage there in concrete terms. Iron railings had been displaced and twisted. There was damage near the tramway terminus. A heavy stone block had been moved onto the concrete path. These details matter because they are not atmospheric impressions. They are material observations. Iron had been bent out of its proper position. Stone had been shifted. A path designed for use had been obstructed by a weight that did not move itself. For an archive report, that distinction is important. Much of the Flannan Isles story later drew strength from absence. No reply to the horn, no response to the rocket, no men in the tower, no bodies recovered. Absence can invite invention. But the West Landing offered a different kind of trace. It did not say who was present. It did not record the moment of danger. It did not name which man stood where. But it did show that the landing had been struck with unusual violence. The damaged iron railings were especially significant. Railings are made to mark and protect a route. They fix a human path across unsafe ground. When Muirhead noted that they had been displaced and twisted, the description suggested more than ordinary wear or loosened fittings. It placed force at the working edge of the island. The railings were part of the infrastructure that made the landing usable. Damage to them meant that the place itself had been altered by the weather. Near the tramway terminus, the meaning deepened. The tramway was not a decorative feature. It belonged to the practical design of the station, the movement of supplies from the landing toward the lighthouse. A terminus is a point of transfer, a place where one kind of movement ends and another begins. Damage there connected the storm not only to the shore, but to the operational lifeline of the station. It showed that the sea had not merely broken against rocks below. It had reached into the apparatus by which the lighthouse was served. The heavy stone block moved onto the concrete path became another central detail. In ordinary language, a stone lying on a path might seem small beside the disappearance of 3 men. But in an investigation built from physical traces, a moved stone could speak to the magnitude of force. Muirhead did not need to imagine violence in general terms. The record contained an object displaced from where it should have been and placed where use of the path would be affected. A heavy block on a concrete route meant that the sea or storm-driven force associated with it had carried or shifted matter across a human-made surface. This is why the West Landing evidence became central to the official reconstruction. The tower had shown order. The shore showed disturbance. Inside the lighthouse, the evidence pointed away from a struggle, panic, or long internal disorder. Outside, the West Landing pointed toward a severe weather event, powerful enough to damage fixed equipment and move heavy material. The two areas of evidence did not solve the mystery alone, but together they narrowed the field. The official mind did not have the luxury of legend. It had to work with what could be inspected. Muirhead's report, dated 8 January 1901, came from a superintendent examining the aftermath, not from a witness watching the moment itself. That limited what could be claimed. He could describe damage. He could connect that damage with the known absence of the men and the known condition of the station. He could form a probable explanation, but the report could not restore the missing sequence minute by minute. That caution is part of the case. The West Landing evidence is powerful because it is physical, but it is not complete. Railings may show that seas struck high and hard. A damaged tramway terminus may show that working ground was compromised. A heavy stone block moved onto the concrete path may show force beyond ordinary conditions. Yet none of these details can say exactly when the keepers came down what they saw, what they intended to secure, or whether all three were together at the decisive moment. The record therefore begins to form a shape rather than a scene. The men were not found inside the tower. The working spaces were in order. Outdoor clothing was missing for 2 men. The last readings were left on the slate, waiting to be transferred. At the west landing, equipment and structures had been damaged by storm action. These details align around an outdoor emergency, but they do not become a complete eyewitness account. It is tempting, in a mystery like this, to treat every damaged object as if it were a sentence in a final message. But the archive does not work that way. It gives fragments with different degrees of certainty. The slate tells us that routine continued until it stopped. The state of the light room tells us that the light had been prepared for service. The missing clothing suggests movement outside, though not every movement can be reconstructed. The west landing damage tells us that the sea had left marks of exceptional force on the island's working edge. Together, these fragments shifted the investigation away from the interior contradiction and toward the exposed shore. The central question was no longer only why the light failed. It became why trained keepers would leave the security of the station and what they encountered when they reached the landing or the ground near it. Muirhead's damaged railings, damaged terminus, and displaced stone did not answer that question fully. But they gave it a location. That location mattered because the Flannan Isles Lighthouse was built for isolation, but not for invulnerability. Its tower stood high on Eilean Mor, and its system included landings, stairs, paths, and mechanisms that had to function in a severe maritime environment. The lighthouse could rise above the sea, but the work of maintaining it still depended on men moving through places where the sea could reach. The West Landing was one of those places. In Muirhead's report, it became the point where the orderly world of watchkeeping met evidence of sudden, destructive force. The force itself remained unnamed in the objects, but its outline was visible. Twisted iron. Damage near the tramway terminus. A stone block shifted onto the path. These were the marks from which the official explanation would grow. Not a confession beneath the stairs, not a hidden note, not a dramatic signal sent into the dark, but a pattern of damage at the shore. From that pattern, Muirhead would move toward his conclusion that the men had probably gone out to inspect or secure something near the landings and had been caught by an unexpected large wave. The West Landing did not prove every step. It did something quieter and more important for the record. It made the accident theory physically plausible, and it placed the last known logic of the case not inside the tower, but at the damaged edge of Eilean Mor, where the sea had left its evidence behind. The West Landing gave Robert Muirhead the part of the record that the lighthouse rooms could not provide. Inside, the evidence had been orderly: trimmed lamps, cleaned machinery, a tidied kitchen, readings left for later transfer. Outside, the evidence was physical damage: iron railings displaced and twisted, damage near the tramway terminus, and a heavy stone block moved onto the concrete path. Between those two sets of facts, Muirhead formed the conclusion that became the official center of the case. He did not have bodies. He did not have an eyewitness. He did not have a radio message from Eilean Mor, because no radio communication existed between the Flannan Isles Lighthouse and Lewis at the time. What he had was a broken pattern. The light had gone out. The relief vessel Hesperus had been delayed by weather. When Joseph Moore entered the station on 26 December 1900, the keepers were gone, but the lighthouse itself was not in a state of abandonment or long disorder. Then, at the exposed shore, there were signs that the sea had struck the landing with unusual violence. Muirhead's report, dated 8 January 1901, drew those facts into a probable sequence. The men, he believed, had likely left the lighthouse to inspect or secure gear near the landings. While they were there, an unexpected large wave caught them. In this interpretation, the disappearance was not the result of something hidden inside the tower. It was an outdoor accident, connected to the ordinary risks of maintaining a light on a remote island in the outer Hebrides. The word probably matters. It is not a decorative caution. It is the boundary of the evidence. Muirhead could say what the facts suggested. He could not say that he had seen the moment of loss. The men had disappeared on a small island, west of the Isle of Lewis, after a period of bad weather that had kept the relief from reaching them. By the time Hesperus arrived, the critical events were already days old. The sea had continued to move. Rain, wind, and surf had continued to work over the landings. Any final footprints, if they ever existed, were not preserved as a recoverable record. Still, the accident theory had weight because it tied several pieces of evidence together without requiring additions outside the archive. The first piece was the missing outdoor clothing for 2 men. Moore found that outdoor clothing was missing for 2 keepers, while the station remained otherwise prepared. This suggested that at least 2 of the men had left the building dressed for work outside. In Muirhead's reasoning, that detail pointed away from a sudden departure and panic from inside the tower and toward a practical duty at the exposed edge of the station. The second piece was the nature of lighthouse work on Eilean Mor. The station was not only a tower on high ground. It was a working installation connected to landing places, stairs, a tramway, and equipment that had to survive difficult seas. The lighthouse had been built for isolation, but it still depended on contact with the shore below, supplies, reliefs, gear, and access by vessel. The landing places were therefore not incidental. They were part of the operational system. If bad weather damaged fittings or threatened equipment near the landing, keepers could have a reason to go down and inspect or secure what they could. The third piece was the damage itself. Muirhead's report described storm damage at the West Landing in terms that were not vague impressions. Iron railings had been displaced and twisted. Damage appeared near the tramway terminus. A heavy stone block had been moved onto the concrete path. These were not details that prove the exact positions of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur at the fatal moment, but they do show that the West Landing had been struck by force strong enough to move and deform solid material. For an investigator trying to account for 3 missing men and no bodies, the damaged landing gave the sea a visible role in the case. That is why the wave theory remains different from the later legends that gathered around Flannan. It does not require invented conversations, supernatural warnings, or a staged scene around a meal. Its force comes from ordinary details placed under extreme conditions. A lighthouse crew on a remote Atlantic island. Outdoor clothing missing for 2 men. A damaged landing. A delayed relief. No radio link. No recovered bodies. Those are plain facts, but together they form a severe possibility. The theory also explains why the order inside the lighthouse was so important. If the interior had shown a long period of confusion, or signs of violence, or a struggle, the explanation might have had to move in another direction. But the lamps were trimmed and ready. The lens and machinery were cleaned. The kitchen was tidied. The readings for 14 December and 15 December had been noted on a slate for later transfer to the log. Those traces suggested that the normal work of the station had continued until something interrupted it. Muirhead's conclusion placed that interruption outside, at the point where work met weather. There is one difficulty often felt in the accident theory: how 3 men could all be lost. The official record, as preserved in the research trail, does not provide a witnessed answer. It does not let us reconstruct every movement. But Muirhead's explanation did not require that all 3 had calmly walked into visible danger. It required only that the men were near enough to the exposed shore, during conditions shaped by storm and heavy sea, for a large, unexpected wave to overtake them. The West Landing evidence showed that the sea had reached with destructive power. The missing clothing showed that men had gone out. The absence of bodies left the last moment beyond proof. This is the character of the official explanation, strong enough to be plausible, limited enough to remain incomplete. It makes sense of the known evidence, but it does not close every gap. It tells us why the West Landing mattered, but not the exact route taken from the lighthouse. It connects the men's work to the damaged shore, but does not tell us who went first, who followed, or whether one man attempted to help another. It explains why drowning became the likely cause, but it cannot provide a final witness scene. Donald MacArthur's presence adds another quiet complication. He was serving as occasional keeper while William Ross was off sick. James Ducat was the principal keeper. Thomas Marshall was the assistant lightkeeper. Their different roles tell us who was on duty, but they do not tell us how decisions were made that day. The official reconstruction remains careful because the archive cannot recover the human sequence inside the emergency. It can identify the men. It can identify the station. It can identify the damaged landing. It can identify the absence. But it cannot hear the last exchange between them, if there was one. The landscape itself makes the conclusion understandable. Eilean Mor stands exposed in the Flannan Isles, the Seven Hunters, west of Lewis. The lighthouse was placed high, on the island's greatest point, so that its beam could serve shipping at distance. But the keepers did not live only in the lantern room. Their work brought them to stairs, landings, stores, and gear. The sea that made the lighthouse necessary also pressed against the means of keeping it supplied and maintained. The danger was built into the job, not as drama, but as geography. In that sense, the wave theory is not a simple ending. It is an explanation shaped by what remained. A wave leaves no signature like a written confession. It may leave twisted iron, moved stone, damaged fittings, and absence. It may erase more than it reveals. Muirhead's report read those marks as the aftermath of a sudden sea. The conclusion was not that the mystery had vanished, but that the most grounded cause lay at the West Landing, where an ordinary duty could have become fatal in a single moment. The title of this episode speaks of a last message beneath the stairs, but the record keeps resisting the shape of a message in the dramatic sense. The last traces are administrative and material: slate readings, prepared lamps, missing clothing, damaged railings, a shifted stone. They do not speak in one voice, but they point in one direction. The men were likely not taken by something inside the lighthouse. They were likely taken at the edge of the island, by the sea they had been appointed to watch over. And yet, even after Muirhead's conclusion, the official language could not become certainty. The bodies were never found. The precise sequence remained unknown. The archive could move from evidence to probability, but not from probability to sight. That limitation would follow the case into the formal records, where the state would have to name the loss in legal terms. There, the entries for Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur would preserve both the conclusion and the uncertainty. Disappearance on or about 15 December 1900, and death recorded not as witnessed fact, but as probably drowning. After Muirhead's report, the case entered a different kind of record. The damaged West Landing, the missing outdoor clothing, and the orderly rooms had supported a probable explanation, but they had not produced witnesses. They had not returned the bodies of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, or Donald MacArthur. They had not supplied the one thing an official register prefers above all else: an observed end. So the disappearance moved from investigation into registration. It had to be written down in the language of the state. That language is often mistaken for certainty. A register looks final because it is formal. It gives names, places, dates, occupations, and causes. It fixes a loss into columns. It turns a human absence into an entry that can be searched, copied, and certified. But the Flannan Isles records show something more complicated. They show that official language can be precise and limited at the same time. It can say what was known. It can say what was believed. It can also mark, quietly, the point where knowledge ended. The service register entries for James Ducat and Thomas Marshall include a note that they disappeared on or about 15 December 1900. That phrase matters. It does not say they were seen to die on that date. It does not say the sea was witnessed taking them. It does not even say the exact hour was known. It says on or about, a careful phrase that holds the known timeline without pretending to close it. By the time that wording was entered, the chain of evidence had already narrowed the possible window. The light was reported out by a passing steamer around midnight on 15 December. National Records of Scotland identifies that vessel as SS Archtor under Captain Holman. The relief vessel Hesperus did not reach Eilean Mor until 26 December, after weather had delayed the relief. Joseph Moore then entered the lighthouse and found the station deserted. The last formal log entries had been made for 13 December, while readings for 14 December and 15 December had been left on a slate for later transfer. Those details made 15 December the strongest date in the record. But they did not make it a witness date of death. The phrase on or about preserves that distinction. It allows the register to align with the available evidence while acknowledging that the vital moment was not seen. For Ducat and Marshall, the register note is also a reminder that they were not merely characters in a mystery. They were employees within a system of service. Ducat had entered the service of the Commissioners of Northern Lighthouses on 21 November 1878. Marshall had entered the service on 27 April 1896 after earlier work connected with seafaring and as an occasional keeper at Ailsa Craig. Their names were held not only in newspaper reports and later retellings, but in the administrative records of lighthouse work, records built for appointments, duties, service, illness, relief, and loss. Donald MacArthur's position was different in one respect. He was serving as occasional keeper while William Ross was off sick. But in the death record, he belonged to the same event. All three men were recorded in the Carloway death register, with cause of death noted as probably drowning. Again, the word probably is not incidental. It is the official record refusing to say more than the evidence could support. There is a quiet force in that restraint. In a story that later attracted legend, speculation, and literary invention, the register did not dramatize. It did not describe a final conversation. It did not imagine a panic inside the tower. It did not turn the slate into a confession or the staircase into a scene of revelation. It wrote a legal conclusion in cautious terms, probably drowning. That conclusion fits the official reconstruction shaped by Robert Muirhead. His report of 8 January 1901 describes storm damage at the West Landing, displaced and twisted iron railings, damage near the tramway terminus, and a heavy stone block moved onto the concrete path. From those marks and from the condition of the lighthouse interior, he concluded that the men had probably gone out to inspect or secure gear near the landings and had been caught by an unexpected large wave. But probably drowning also marks the gap left by the missing bodies. In many death records, the cause can be tied to a body examined, a witness statement, or a medical observation. Here, the state was recording death without recovery. The men were gone from the station. The light had failed. Their duties had stopped. The physical evidence pointed toward the sea, but no body had returned to confirm the exact cause, the exact sequence, or the exact place where each man was overcome. The Carloway death register therefore stands as both conclusion and admission. It says the deaths were accepted into the civil record. It also says the ending remained partly beyond proof. The place of registration adds its own frame. Carloway was not the lighthouse tower. It was not the West Landing. It was not the exposed edge of Eilean Mor, where the sea had left its damage. The entry belonged to the civil geography of Lewis and the surrounding district, to the world ashore where losses were documented, families were informed, and institutions maintained their records. The keepers had lived within a system that connected Eilean Mor to Breshcleet, Loch Rogue, Lewis, the Northern Lighthouse Commissioners, and the observer system that watched from Gallon Head. After the disappearance, the same network carried their absence back into official form. In that sense, the registers are another kind of transmission. They are not urgent like a telegram. They are not operational like a log. They are not provisional like readings left on a slate. They are slower, colder, and more permanent. They do not ask for help. They do not direct a vessel. They do not guide a relief keeper up the stairs. They preserve the administrative outcome of a search that had already failed to recover the men. And yet, because they are so restrained, they are among the most important records in the case. They show what the official account could responsibly say after the search and what it could not say. It could say that James Ducat and Thomas Marshall disappeared on or about 15 December 1900. It could say that Ducat, Marshall, and Donald MacArthur were recorded as dead. It could say that the cause was probably drowning. It could place their loss within the machinery of civil record and lighthouse administration. It could not say who first noticed danger at the landing. It could not say whether one man went down and the others followed. It could not say whether they were inspecting damage, securing gear, or responding to a sudden threat near the shore. It could not say the precise wave, the precise minute, or the final movement each man made. The difference between those two categories is where the mystery still lives. Not in the absence of an official explanation, because there was one. Not in a lack of physical evidence, because the West Landing bore marks of violence. Not in a total silence of records, because the records are unusually powerful in their cumulative effect. The mystery remains in the space between probability and witness. That space is small in wording and large in meaning. A death register is designed to close an event. It gives society a way to proceed. It allows institutions to settle accounts, families to mourn within a recognized fact, and future researchers to locate the loss in time. But in the Flannan Isles case, Closure came with a qualifying word attached. Probably, the register did not challenge Muirhead's theory. It echoed its caution. It turned his probable accident into a recorded probable cause. That is why the official documents should not be read as weak simply because they are careful. Their caution is part of their value. The archive does not need to invent certainty to be meaningful. It can show the outline of an event with enough clarity to make one explanation most plausible while still preserving the honest absence at the center. For Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur, the final official wording is therefore deeply plain. No recovered bodies. No witnessed deaths. No last message spoken from the edge of the island. Only entries: disappearance on or about 15 December 1900, and cause of death probably drowning. The lighthouse, however, did not end with those entries. After the registers had absorbed the loss, the station remained on Eilean Mor. The tower still stood on the highest point of the island. The buildings, stairs, landings, and shore connections remained part of the Northern Lighthouse system. The beam that had once failed and summoned the mystery would continue to serve mariners for decades, long after the names of the missing men had been fixed in the formal record. The archive had written what it could of their ending. The lighthouse itself would carry the story forward in stone, metal, light, and later, automation. After the registers had fixed the loss in official language, Eilean Mor did not become a closed file. The lighthouse remained where it had been built, on the highest point of the island, still part of the working chain of the Northern Lighthouse system. The disappearance of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur belonged to December 1900, but the station itself continued into ordinary service. Relief still had to be managed. Weather still governed access. The light still had to answer the darkness west of Lewis. That long continuation matters. In mystery stories, a place often seems to stop at the moment of its unanswered event. The rooms are left as they were. The door stays half open. The last known trace becomes the final frame. But a lighthouse cannot remain only a scene. Its purpose is repetition, night after night, flash after flash, warning after warning. After the investigation, after the report, after the death records at Carloway, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse returned to that purpose. For decades, the station remained manned. The island, that had taken 3 keepers in the public memory, still required keepers in fact. Men continued to serve in the same exposed environment, within the same wider system of relief vessels, shore stations, stairs, landing places, and weather judgment. The earlier absence of radio communication had belonged to the conditions of 1900. Later systems would change the nature of watchkeeping, but the central geography could not be changed. Eilean Mor still lay out in the Flannan Isles, west of the Isle of Lewis, with the Atlantic around it and difficult landings below. The official end of manned service came on 28 September 1971. On that date, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse was demanned and became a major automatic light. The phrase is administrative, but its consequences are profound. A manned lighthouse is a workplace with human routine built into its structure. There are keepers' duties, relief schedules, personal effects, log entries, cleaning, trimming, observations, meals, and decisions made under pressure. An automatic light is still a warning to mariners, but it changes the human relation to the tower. The continuous watch is transferred from resident men to mechanisms, maintenance visits, and remote oversight. At Flannan, automation also changed the emotional frame of the old mystery. The disappearance had occurred in a world where a station could fall silent and no one on shore could immediately ask why. The men could not send a radio call to Lewis. The safety chain depended on the visible beam, the appointed observer at Gallon Head, telegrams, and the ability of a relief vessel to reach the island. When the light became automatic in 1971, the station entered a different era of lighthouse history. The beam remained, but the old form of human isolation that shaped the December 1900 case had passed. This does not mean the island became empty of meaning. If anything, the demanning helped turn the complex into something more clearly historical. The buildings were no longer only instruments of daily service. They became evidence of a former system, the age of keepers living by rota on remote stations, of shore families at places such as Briskleet, of tenders waiting on weather, of lamps and lenses requiring hands. Historic Environment Scotland now lists the Flannan Isles Lighthouse Complex as a Category B designated building. That status places the site within Scotland's protected built heritage. It is not only the mystery that survives, but the material form of the station, the tower, the keeper's house, the fabric of a working maritime installation. Historic Environment Scotland describes the lighthouse as a 23-meter whitewashed rubble tower with a single-story keeper's house clasping its base. Even that phrase, clasping its base, is useful. It reminds us that the tower was not an isolated monument in the abstract. It was part of a compact working complex, designed for people and duty as much as for light. The tower's details also carry the engineering language of its period. Historic Environment Scotland records cast iron decking, a lantern with diagonal astragals, a domed cap, and a weather vane. Inside, the lighthouse includes a serpentine cast iron staircase with a timber handrail. These are not merely architectural notes. In this story, they are part of the surviving archive. They describe the physical world through which the keepers moved. They give texture to the space Joseph Moore entered when he found the station deserted. They also keep the investigation grounded. The mystery did not happen in a vague tower from legend. It happened in a specific engineered place, built from stone, iron, glass, timber, and routine. The present light continues to have a defined character. The current light characteristic is 2 white flashes every 30 seconds. The Northern Lighthouse Board gives the elevation as 101 meters and the range as 20 nautical miles. Those figures carry the modern station back into its original purpose. The light is still identified, not by romance, but by measurable facts: color, rhythm, height, distance. To a mariner, the pattern matters because it distinguishes one aid to navigation from another. 2 white flashes every 30 seconds is a form of language at sea. It is not a message of mystery. It is a message of position, warning, and recognition. That is one of the quiet contradictions of the Flannan case. The lighthouse is remembered because the light failed in December 1900, yet its longer history is one of persistence. It was built to mark danger and continued to do so for more than 70 years as a manned station, then continued again as an automatic light. The disappearance did not destroy the institution's function. The tower did not become only a memorial. It kept working, and yet the unresolved event remained attached to it. No later automation could explain the missing hours between the last known records and the discovery by Hesperus. No heritage listing could restore the bodies. No present-day light characteristic could turn probability into witnessed fact. The official explanation, shaped by Robert Muirhead's report, remained the strongest source-grounded account. The men probably went out near the landings and were caught by an unexpected large wave. But the precise sequence was not recovered. The sea had left damage, not testimony. Heritage can preserve stone and metal. It can classify buildings, protect fabric, record architectural value, and place a site within national memory. It cannot always preserve the human moment that made the place famous. At Eilean Mor, the protected complex and the unresolved disappearance now occupy the same ground. One belongs to survey, designation, and maintenance. The other belongs to absence, inference, and the limits of the record. That is why the lighthouse, after the mystery, is not an epilogue in the simple sense. It is part of the evidence of how the story survived. The station continued because maritime systems depend on continuity. The story continued because the central break in that continuity was never fully seen. Between those two facts, Flannan became both working infrastructure and remembered mystery. By the time the light became automatic, the old daily life of the keepers had withdrawn from Eilean Mor. What remained was the tower, the buildings at its base, the landings below, the stairs between sea and station, and the official traces already examined: the report of the unlit beam, the delayed arrival of Hesperus, the orderly rooms, the slate readings, the missing outdoor clothing, the damaged west landing, and the death records that could only say, probably drowning. The lighthouse still speaks in flashes. The archive speaks in fragments. The final question is how those fragments should be read together. There was no confirmed farewell from the keepers, no radio transmission from the island, and no recorded last words. But beneath the ordinary structure of the station, in the routine left behind and the silence around it, there remains something close to a final message. Not a sentence, not a confession, not a legend. A pattern of traces waiting to be assembled with care. The pattern, when read with care, is quieter than the legend that grew around it. It does not begin with a farewell note folded on a table. It does not begin with a voice over a wireless set, because there was no radio communication between Flannan and Lewis. It does not begin with a keeper calling his own disappearance into the record. The final message from Eilean Mor was never transmitted in that way. It was left in objects. That is why this case still holds its shape after more than a century. The strongest evidence is not dramatic. It is practical. It is the kind of evidence produced by men doing routine work in a dangerous place. Lamps trimmed and ready, lens and machinery cleaned, kitchen tidied, readings written on a slate for later transfer, outdoor clothing missing, and below the tower, the west landing broken by the sea. Taken separately, each trace says little. Together, they form the last readable sequence the archive allows. Inside the lighthouse, Joseph Moore found order. That fact matters because disorder would have pointed the investigation in another direction. A struggle inside the tower, a prolonged breakdown of routine, a station abandoned over time. Those possibilities are not supported by the recorded condition of the rooms. The light room and machinery had not been left as if the keepers had neglected their duty for days. The lamps were prepared. The lens and machinery were clean. The kitchen was tidy. The ordinary discipline of lighthouse service was still present, even though the men themselves were gone. The slate is part of that same message. National Records of Scotland records that the last log entries were for 13 December, while readings for 14 December and 15 December were noted on a slate for later transfer to the log. That detail is almost painfully ordinary. It is not a warning. It is not a confession. It is a work note inside a working system. It tells us that the routine had not simply collapsed. At least up to those readings, the machinery of record-keeping continued. And then it stopped. The silence after that point has often been filled by imagination, but the archive gives no confirmed last words. It gives no verified scene of a meal interrupted, no written farewell from James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, or Donald MacArthur, and no distress signal sent from the island. The absence of a radio link is central. Eilean Mor could be watched from Lewis, and failures could be reported by telegram from outside the island, but the keepers could not send a modern emergency call from the station. If something sudden happened below the lighthouse, the men had no simple way to speak beyond the rock. That is why the physical station had to speak for them. The missing outdoor clothing was one of the strongest interior clues. It did not prove the exact route taken by the men, but it helped Robert Muirhead form the official reconstruction. Moor's knowledge of the keepers' habits gave weight to the inference that Ducat and Marshall, at least, had gone outside toward the landings or exposed ground. The archive does not give us a witness decision. It does not say who first noticed trouble below, or whether one man went out and others followed, or whether the emergency seemed small enough to manage until the sea made it final. But it does show that the absence was connected not to the rooms above, but to the weather-facing edges of the island. Below the tower, the west landing supplied the harder evidence. Muirhead's report of 8 January 1901 described storm damage there, iron railings displaced and twisted, damage near the tramway terminus, and a heavy stone block moved onto the concrete path. Those details are not ornamental. They are the physical measure of force. They show that the sea had struck the landing with enough power to bend metal, shift stone, and damage the working structures used to move supplies between vessel and lighthouse. That is why Muirhead concluded that the men had probably gone down to inspect or secure gear near the landings and had been caught by an unexpected large wave. His conclusion did not require a supernatural cause, nor did it pretend to know every movement. It was a practical explanation built from practical evidence: missing clothing, damaged landing, exposed terrain, and the known danger of the sea around Eilean Mor. The death records preserved that same caution. The men were recorded in the Carloway death register with cause of death noted as probably drowning. That word probably is important. It is not weakness in the record. It is honesty. The bodies were not recovered. The final moment was not witnessed. The state could record the likely cause, but it could not turn probability into sight. So the final message beneath the stairs is not hidden in a secret chamber. It is not a note tucked under a tread of the serpentine cast-iron staircase. It is the silence under that staircase, the gap between the ordered interior and the broken landing below. The stairs join two worlds, the disciplined world of the lighthouse, with its trimmed lamps and clean machinery, and the exposed world of cranes, railings, concrete paths, tramway gear, spray, wind, and sea. The message lies in the passage between them. Above, the work was ready to continue. Below, something had gone wrong. The title of this episode points us toward that space, because it is where the mystery becomes human. Not in fantasy, but in movement. A keeper leaving the safe interior. Another, perhaps, following. A routine inspection becoming urgent. A hazard at the landing seeming manageable until it was not. The archive cannot confirm the order, and it should not be made to say more than it says. But it can show why the official explanation has endured. It fits the evidence without needing to invent a voice. This is also why the Flannan Isles disappearance remains so powerful as a lost transmission. A lost transmission is not only a message that was sent and never received. Sometimes it is a message that could not be sent at all. On Eilean Mor, there was no radio. There was only the light, the observer system, the relief vessel, the telegrams, the reports, the registers, and the material evidence left after the men were gone. The first warning came from absence, the beam not burning around midnight on 15 December 1900, reported by the passing steamer, identified in National Records of Scotland records as SS Archtor under Captain Holman. The next silence came from weather, delaying Hesperus until 26 December. Then came Captain Harvey's report of no sign of life, no answer to the horn, no response to a rocket. Then Mor's discovery of an empty but orderly station. Then Muirhead's report, turning damage at the West Landing into a probable explanation. Then the death register, preserving the final official phrase, probably drowning. Each stage is a message, but none is complete. That incompleteness is the reason the story has outlived its file. If a body had been found, if a witness had survived, if a radio call had named the danger, the case would still have been tragic, but it would not carry the same unresolved pressure. What remains instead is a chain of official traces, interrupted at the exact point where human testimony is most wanted. The stronger reading is still the simplest one, supported by the sources. The three keepers most likely died in an accident involving the sea. The damaged West Landing shows the sea had the force to make that happen. The missing clothing points outward. The orderly rooms argue against a long internal crisis. The Slate readings show routine close to the end. The registers record probable drowning. Nothing in the archive requires a more elaborate explanation. But source-grounded certainty stops short of the final scene. It cannot tell us whether all three men were together when the wave came. It cannot say whether one man was already in danger and the others tried to help. It cannot tell us whether the event happened exactly on 15 December or within the uncertain window around it. It cannot recover the sound of the sea at that moment, or the last words spoken on the stairs, if any were spoken at all. That is the boundary of the archive, and at that boundary, the lighthouse remains. Built on the highest point of Eilean Mor, west of the Isle of Lewis, part of the Flannan Isles, also known as the Seven Hunters, it continued long after the disappearance. It stayed manned until 28 September 1971, when it was demanned and became a major automatic light. Today, the complex is recognized by Historic Environment Scotland as a Category B designated building, and the Northern Lighthouse Board records the light with an elevation of 101 meters and a range of 20 nautical miles. The beam still has a language. 2 white flashes every 30 seconds. Regular, mechanical, distant, and clear. But the message from December 1900 is different. It is not clear in that way. It is made of interruption. A light that failed. A vessel delayed. A tower found ready. A slate not copied into the log. Clothing gone from its place. Railings twisted at the West Landing. A stone moved by force. 3 men entered into the record as disappeared on or about 15 December and as probably drowned. That is as close as the archive brings us. The last message beneath the stairs is therefore not a hidden sentence, but a pattern left by duty meeting weather. It says that the keepers were still working. It says that something outside the tower drew them down or out. It says that the sea had struck the landing with unusual violence. It says that the men did not return. Everything beyond that must be handled gently. The Flannan Isles disappearance endures because it is both explained and unresolved. The likely cause is visible enough: an accident at the edge of the island, probably involving an unexpected wave. The exact sequence is missing. Between those two facts lies the silence that has carried the story forward. Not a ghost story. Not a solved case in the fullest sense. Not a transmission received from the men themselves. Only the lighthouse, the sea, and the traces they left behind.